is, what it includes, why it's important, and how to teach it. We've heard from many of you asking for this information and wanting to learn some new skills. We also understand that many of you are not as comfortable about this topic as you'd like to be. You're definitely not alone, and we're here to help. Each webinar in this series will be hosted by myself, Sasha Grenier, with expert guest speakers. During the webinar, we will accept questions in the chat window and weave them throughout. If we don't get to answering all of them, we will get back to you later with responses and resources. You will remain muted for this webinar. This webinar is also being recorded and will be available on the Oregon Educators Network Comprehensive Sexuality Education site. Resources and links will be sent out to participants after this webinar as well. If this webinar gives you an interest in beginning further conversations with your colleagues across the state, please visit the discussion forum page on the Oregon Educators Network. We can all continue the conversation there. So the webinar today will be about parent, family, and caregiver engagement in sexuality education. We've heard from many of you that you could use more strategies and skills on how to connect with and involve caregivers and community members in health education. Today, we will focus on learning from educators about programs that have worked to do this. So we'll start by introducing ourselves, some brief introductions, and we'll hear more from our presenters later on today. So this will be just a brief intro. So I'm Sasha Grenier. I'm the Sexuality Education and School Health Specialist at the Oregon Department of Education. One of my roles here at ODE is to support school districts in implementing effective sexuality education and promoting health and safety among students across the state. My work revolves around the important intersections between health and education. So although this series is hosted by ODE, we also know that educational outcomes are impacted by student and community physical health, social health, mental health, and so on. To talk more about this today, our guest presenters are joining us from Bend and Portland to talk about how to engage parents and caregivers in this important work. First, we welcome Liliana Cabrera, who has been an educator and facilitator for over 12 years, 9 years of which she's been working for Planned Parenthood in Miramonte, California, and now at Planned Parenthood Columbia Willamette for the last 3 years. Her experience working in rural areas and with diverse communities has proved valuable in supporting organizations serving rural communities by providing culturally relevant education sessions in both English and Spanish, and developing community voices in advancing equity and inclusion in Central Oregon. Liliana also serves as a board member for the Let's Talk Diversity Coalition, the Latino Community Association, and Out Central Oregon. Secondly, Vanessa Torre is the Health and Wellness Coordinator at Latino Network. Prior to that, she was a Family Engagement Specialist there. Previously, Vanessa worked at the Cascade AIDS Project as the Youth HIV Education Coordinator, where she developed and implemented a comprehensive, culturally appropriate, positive youth development sexuality engagement education program. She is also a certified HIV testing counselor. As a bicultural, first-generation Latina, Vanessa is proud of her heritage and passionate about using her background in youth development, cross-cultural communication, and behavioral health to support parents and families. Before they get started, a bit of a background. Why is this topic important? Why is it important to engage parents and caregivers in school-based education? Well, firstly, they can be great allies in our work. We know that based on many surveys, an overwhelming majority of community members support comprehensive, medically accurate, and age-appropriate sex ed. They say that young people need both to be taught about delaying the onset of intimate sexual relationships until they are mature and responsible, and also given the information and skills they need to use condoms and contraception when they choose to become sexually active. It's not either or, but both. Most community members will actually be supportive, helpful, and eager to be involved. It's also important to know that sex ed at school and parents play an important piece of this puzzle. They are the most effective when done together. Sex ed supplements and does not replace discussions at home. In fact, sex educators rely on the foundations that parents and caregivers have taught their children in regards to values, to build on in the classroom. Additionally, when many different community members, parents, and caregivers are involved in the process of making sex ed medically accurate, they can play a helpful role so as to support school districts in promoting instruction and materials that are not discriminatory, biased, or fear-based. And research says that this works. When parents and caregivers reinforce these messages of health, inclusivity, and safety, we know that children learn it better. When parents and caregivers are engaged in classroom-based instruction, academic achievement, behavior, and social skills improve. It's also shown to support young people avoiding unhealthy behaviors, such as sexual risk behaviors, tobacco and alcohol, and other drug misuse. Oregon law also requires us to engage parents, caregivers, communities in school district processes for creating sex ed policies. Parents and caregivers also have the right to review and be notified of materials used within plans of instruction. They can also opt out of any piece of sexuality education, but we hope that with thoughtful engagement, opt-out will be rare and selective. This notification process can be a great opportunity to engage with parents, caregivers, to say that sex ed isn't all about sex, right? It's about health, respect, safety, and so much more. So how else can we do that? I would like to now open the platform to Liliana, who's going to join us. She's in Bend, Oregon, to tell us a little bit about her experience and the things she's learned throughout her many years of experience engaging communities. So thank you so much for joining us, Liliana. You are now unmuted. 1 second. Liliana, okay, there we go. We unmuted you, so feel free to get started. Thank you.
All right, thanks for having me. This is Liliana. If you want to go into the next slide, just a little bit about where I am in Central Oregon. My pronouns are she and her, and I work out of our Bend Health Center office. And this is about the region that I serve. So it is pretty spread out, but recognizing that our rural communities, the population size might be a little bit smaller, but it does take a little bit to really reach and engage many people in the community. So just a little bit of map. So these are some things to consider. I rephrase this from the challenges because some of these things can make this work difficult in rural communities, but at the same time, they are points to be able to think about how can we move through these and reach out to families in the most meaningful ways. So some of these things to consider, of course, distance and transportation. How far does it take for somebody to be able to get to the site that we are inviting them to, and considering some other issues that might be occurring for them. So if they are driving at night, what are some additional things that people might have concerns around on the weekends? What are the language and literacy skills for parenting adults and families that are reaching out to? Thinking about sex and sexuality, they can be very sensitive topics, and some families may not have had comprehensive sex ed in their lives. In our LIFT program that I'm going to talk about in a little bit, out of 213 families, 21% of the participating parents had received previous education about adolescent development or communicating with their teen about sexuality. So being able to build trust takes some time, so thinking about that as well, just kind of what the baseline of their information around sex and sexuality might be, and that this is an opportunity to be able to share some more information and knowledge with them. And then also really gauging where they're at and what it is that is important to them and they want to be able to share with the young people in their care. And it takes some investment, so Some of the things that I'm going to talk about will take time, it will take a lot of energy, and then it can also require putting some monetary investment into being able to meet folks where they are. And then thinking about what the community culture is in the community, how that's going to impact how willing and open families will be about this topic. And then cultural and historical trauma for communities of color and system and poverty-impacted families. Patterns throughout history and public health and education have a lasting effect not only on our relationships with health and the schools, but also our overall well-being. And another slide coming up will have more details. So we can go to the next one. And so these are some of the strategies that I have used. So considering the organization that I'm working for, Planned Parenthood, can be a little bit difficult to engage in rural communities. So thinking about how to reach out, starting with trauma-informed practices. And if you are familiar with trauma-informed practices, I'm going to ask to use this opportunity just to put an indication, like a yes or a no, if you've been introduced to trauma-informed practices in the chat box. Great. I'm seeing some yeses. And so when we think about trauma-informed care, many times it is very focused on the nuclear family or what's going on in the home or in the immediate environment of a young person. But we also want to think about other traumas that come from systems and institutions, particularly around rural and culturally specific communities. Approachability and accessibility, how to create, a welcoming persona or just being authentic in our own true selves is very welcoming. Meeting the language and literacy levels where folks are, providing childcare and accessible spaces, and being culturally responsive, centering the community culture and the values and how the work that we're doing actually does meet that. So the next slide, we have our trauma-informed approach, and this is based on 6 key principles laid out in SAMHSA's concept of trauma and guidance for trauma-informed approach. And so you should be familiar with these: safety, trust and transparency, peer support, collaboration, and empowerment and voice. And so connecting these with the parents that we're working with in our communities is just as important as keeping these in mind when we're working with young folks. When we're thinking about families and safety around immigrant families, acknowledging the real fears and threats that exist is really meaningful. Reassuring safety in regard to identity and citizenship status, and being aware of what the laws and protections are for immigrant families and also for LGBTQ students and families. Trust and transparency, like I mentioned, being authentic and being judgment-free, acknowledging that folks have their own truth and that's what they're going to be showing up with. There's a great quote that says, "Be kind because everyone is fighting a battle on their own." And so keeping that in the forefront as well when we're engaging with families. Allowing space for parenting adults to support each other, and it values the wisdom and the knowledge that they bring as well. So they can be great resources as far as what's important to them and the community within the culture that they are coming from. Centering agency and ownership in their own learning experience. So also involving them in the planning and what it's going to look like for them to be able to participate as well. Yeah, you can go ahead and go into the next slide. And so I'm not going to read this. If you want more information around historical trauma, you can go to SAMHSA's website. Sometimes the trauma that communities have experienced is related to who we are and how we are perceived, the community, our neighborhood, or our schools. Facilitators and educators should have an understanding how these systems affect young people who have experienced trauma, and must be critical of cultural stereotypes and biases that are based on race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity, faith, and or where a family lives. So all of these different things about our identity. And we can go to the next slide. And so these are some particular experiences that different communities have had. And historically, families and youth of color in our culture have less power and privilege and may have had less access or support to gain access to resolve historical trauma. So things like bilingual or bicultural counselors, access to LGBTQ-friendly medical providers, and things like that. Communities of color, and things like experimentation. So when we're thinking about how we are learning about our communities, if we're doing things that historically have had some trauma, things like evaluations, disclosing information on forms, the language that we use around survey groups, and working with families, if one group is getting something and another is not, considering how that can impact our own relationship with families. And so all of this historical experience does impact the way that we engage in real time with medical professionals, with school-based health center staff, and with educators in the schools. Just some of those things like boarding schools and forced assimilation and things like that have had a lasting impact and effect, and it's going to take a lot of work and investment of our own to be able to heal some of those traumas. Schools and education are generally regarded as a path to success in many of our cultures, and our experiences and interactions and relationships with supportive staff, from the front desk to the classroom teacher, all the way to the administrators, can impact our future engagement and connection with the school. And so some key practices in creating some safety and healing some of those historical traumas, creating a positive and affirming environment, and also when we're thinking about how we communicate with our families, sharing the credibility of resources and why we trust them, having that conversation, and being as one-on-one as possible to be able to communicate, what it is that you are bringing forward to them when it comes to sexual health, and how to connect that with their overall well-being as well. Trust and transparency, listing some of those health education standards that particular guest speakers, when they're invited into the classroom or the section of curriculum that's being taught, and connect them with their values and reasoning for that particular standard. Sometimes when we get something that's just written on a piece of paper and it might have some academic language on it, it can be really difficult to read through that. So being able to have a conversation can be really helpful for families to be able to understand and recognize the importance of their student being present in the class when this information is being provided. For peer collaboration and peer support and collaboration, ask for suggested community partners or resources that they trust, that they're aware of. So that way, if they might not feel particularly comfortable to go to a space where they're not comfortable, that then they can be connected with something that they do have some trust and safety around. And then sharing resources for parents to build skills around answering their teens' questions about relationships and sex. So when we know that there are other organizations that are doing this work in the community, and linking them to those services is important, and then also making sure that they are going to be culturally relevant and responsive. So if you can type one trauma-informed approach that you practice in the chat box, that'd be great. And so they can be things like hosting a parent night at school with childcare that's available. Another can be having posters in your class that says that all are welcome, or have a safe space sticker. I'm seeing acknowledging the history you mentioned in our classes. acknowledging that, recognizing that, absolutely. The affirmation of, you know, we know that this has existed. If we aren't affirmed in that, that can be harmful as well. Being open to the experiences of others, absolutely. Okay, so thank you for those that were able to put something into the chat box. I have one more: supporting students in taking breaks if and when they need to. Absolutely. So responding to their needs. And then using content notes in advance of subjects to allow students to process in advance. Absolutely. All right, so our next slide. And trauma-informed and historical trauma, there's going to be a full session on it. So for those that have not yet had more depth in that, definitely stay tuned. That's coming up. I'm going to talk a little bit about approachability and accessibility. So creating that welcoming environment, thinking about the images and the unspoken messages that might be given. I walked into a classroom where French and Spanish were being taught, and this is just a personal anecdote where there were a lot of different images of people speaking French, and they had the little word bubbles, and the one representation of somebody speaking Spanish was a pirate, and it said, "Soy pirata y soy sucio," which means I'm a pirate and I'm dirty. For me, being a Latina person, it was really jarring and made me feel uncomfortable. So thinking about, we want to have representation, but how that representation and what that message is giving in that as well. Language and literacy, I talked a little bit about avoiding acronyms and jargon, and if you are going to provide that, because it's a great tool to be able to say, this is the terminology that we use, but go ahead and also break it down and allow it for welcoming and accessibility for different literacy levels. And then accessible spaces, of course, meeting the needs that are represented in the classroom. And then the next slide, all are valued and welcome. And so these are just some of the practices that we've used in developing our programs and curriculum, and striving to do better when we're translating materials, making sure that it's culturally and linguistically appropriate. Sometimes we get things directly translated, and when they are put out into the community, they don't really quite match what our understandings are, or culturally the way that we address certain things, particularly around sex and sexuality. We aren't very direct about it, and so being nuanced and meaningful is important. The modification for activities, we saw that a little bit in our chat box. So if we need to change different things to make it accessible for all mobility abilities, we want to do that. Offering, and this is what I was talking about, we might want to put some monetary investment into offering childcare. We want to make sure that there are childcare providers available, or if we don't, can we reimburse families for childcare that they are funding out of pocket? Definitely providing food. Food is a really cultural way that we connect. And then engaging families and asking, you know, what are some meals that you really enjoy, some snacks that you really like, of course being cognizant of allergies and things like that. But including folks also increases their engagement and their desire to be involved. One of the things that we did for one of our programs was offering reimbursement for travel. So we did provide some gas cards for when you saw the regions where I'm working. We're talking from Deschutes County into Jefferson County. And so if we're asking folks from Warm Springs to travel into Redmond, we want to make sure that we're doing what we can so that it's accessible for everyone. And so this is a program that I was talking about. So LIFT, Linking Families and Teens, is a program specific to rural communities. And so we did our best to involve families from our program planning all the way up into our implementation. and follow-up. So we did some community needs assessments where we did engage with community groups, had one-on-one conversations with parents, parenting adults, with some teens to see how we were going to shape what our implementation looked like. When we were doing some of the recruitment, definitely some aspects of learning happened through this process. We wanted to make sure that we were being flexible, but also there were limitations with evaluation. When we're working with an outside agency who's not there working directly with communities, some of the requirements that they have don't always match what's culturally responsive. And so being aware in advance before you start working with an evaluator, what are some of the things that are going to match with your community before choosing what that evaluation is going to look like. So when we were talking about those historical traumas, taking the most trauma-informed practice to complete a program evaluation is really important. Any evaluation that excludes families or invites families but just doesn't offer alternatives if they're not chosen for the program can be harmful. So we want to preserve those community relationships, particularly because trust can be really extremely difficult to regain. But families really enjoy the program. Parents learn strategies to connect with their teens. Teens learn how to take care of their sexual health and how to bring their concerns and questions to these parenting adults in their lives. And teens and parents were able to make more decisions collaboratively. And so that was really a goal for parents and teens to come to each other with mutual respect and to be able to work on what their healthy future was going to look like together. And then keeping contact. After a program is over, you know, if you're not envisioning that you're going to continue working with the community with the same level of depth that the program was. This one was a full day of together time with parents and teens. We had some separate time where teens got to talk to each other, parents got to talk with each other and be a little bit vulnerable. You see in the flyer down below, it was a 5-hour program. So we did get into some deep conversations. And so to leave a day and not hear back from a facilitator, an educator, or someone in their community, that can also be uncomfortable. So making sure that you have those warm handoffs after a program comes to conclusion so that they continue to have the support that we provided in the single day session. And then our next program is our Askable Adult. And so talk early, talk often, so we know that when conversations happen regularly, that it's not just one big conversation. Parents want to have tools and some support to be able to continue the conversation. And so what we've found when we were working with parents and also with school staff is what is it that they want to see for their students. And they definitely have, you know, they want them to wait to become sexually active. They want them to form healthy habits and stay away from alcohol and drugs and make safe and healthy decisions about their bodies. So this was definitely a result of really listening and hearing what parents in the community were seeking. I'm going to go really quickly through the next couple of slides because I want to ensure that Vanessa has time for her part of the information that she's brought forward. The last part is centering community culture and values, getting to know the community, listening for and noticing the values that are important to your rural and culturally specific communities. One of the schools that I went to, there was really strong messaging around, you know, sexual health information really needs to come from home and from the parents. And so linking the content and the skills from our family programs to really say, yes, we do support family engagement in connecting teens and parenting adults was really what helped them to support some of the programs that we have available. So always finding that connection of what is the content that we're providing in sexual health education that aligns with their culture. and what they value and what they want for their young folk. And then also going into the curriculum, looking at culturally responsiveness for it, invite local providers to family nights and on-campus events to build that trust with not just ourselves, but with our local resources and referrals. So that was a point of connection. So some of the ideas, just really showing up and being present. So even if things that you might not normally go just on your own, thinking about who you might see. And sometimes, depending on the family and the culture, some folks are really excited to see their teachers or other educators and facilitators out and about. It's like seeing a unicorn sometimes, particularly if it's a cultural event and they see maybe somebody hosting a booth at that event. That shows that there's that value for that particular community space and that culture. So then the last chat box, if you could write in a local event where your school or organization hosts or could host a booth. I know in Central Oregon we've got so many events. There's always a festival happening, and I know I've been present at so many. We've had the Festival of Cultures, we've had Latino Fest, we've had of course, Central Oregon Pride, other things like Fall Fest, Summer Fest, Pride I'm seeing from another participant. One of the things that was really important for me growing up was when we had festivals on school campus, and each of the teachers from each of the grades would have different booths and games from their classroom. And that was a lot of fun, and I got to know my teachers really well and had a lot of fun with them as well. That wasn't just in the classroom. Transition fairs, fundraising walks for young people experiencing disability, I'm seeing in the chat box. Parent and community nights. All right, well, thank you so much for your time and letting me share some of the strategies and information that I've used to do some engagement out in our rural communities of Central Oregon. If you want to connect, my information is below. You can send me an email at liliana.cabrera@ppcw.org.
Great. Thank you so much, Liliana. That was fantastic. I loved how practical and skill-based you were, and I think we all left that presentation with a bit more resources that we feel confident in either learning more about or using right away. So thank you so much. And now I'd love to welcome Vanessa Latore to take the mic. We're so grateful for both of our great presenters today, and the rest of the time will be devoted to Vanessa sharing her experiences and what she's learned in some of her projects and programs. So if you're ready, feel free to start. Thank you again.
Thank you, and thank you everybody for, again, dedicating some time out of your Friday to be part of this webinar. So again, my name is Vanessa. I go by she, her pronouns, and I've been working in sexuality education for about 15 years now. I started, as an outreach educator in HIV and STI prevention focused, and have for the last 15 years worked with primarily youth, LGBTQ youth of color, and youth that have been incarcerated. And so for the last 10 years, since I've been actually here in Oregon, I've had the opportunity to expand and look at sexuality education from the adult parent lens. For my first 5 years working in this field, youth consistently asked me, how can we start this conversation with the adult leaders in our life, our adult mentors? And for the last 10 years, moving here to Oregon, I found a wonderful coalition that I'll be telling you about a little bit later called Oye, Ciencia Educación, where it was parents wanting to start conversations amongst parents and be that askable adult for their youth. And so I'm going to be touching on that a little bit as part of the approach Latino Network had used in our sexuality education with youth and families and the engagement for parents in that education. So first off, I do currently work for Latino Network. I've been here for about almost 4 years now, and I love the work that we do. So if you're not familiar, Latino Network, we work primarily in the Portland metro area, Multnomah County, a little bit in Washington County. And our vision is to see the Latino communities thriving, engaged, and feeling influential and being influential. And so with that, we're a multi-service agency that has a lot of programming with youth and parents across the county, in schools, out of schools, basically any way that we can work with the Latino community, we're doing it. So what we have done is that we've used a community-driven curriculum for parent sexuality education. And that curriculum is called Oye, Enséñase Educación. And it's a curriculum that looks at the Latino community's values and talks about how do these values intervene with or intersect with the conversations around sexuality education. And we've had the opportunity to work with the county health department and other community partners to work on a larger grant project where we received funding to do sexuality education in the schools. And in the after-school programs is where we have been implementing a youth sexuality education curriculum. And there's a parent component. And so we've had the opportunity to engage parents by looking at how to start these conversations with their youth and present what is this youth curriculum that they're going to be engaging and how can the parents learn about these topics at the same time as the youth. So what we've done is that we've led trainings for our educators, our parent educators, which includes community health workers, staff throughout the entire organization. And between 2015 and 2017, we were able to reach about 220 parents through the schools and the communities that we are involved in. And so that's been a huge feat for us to not just be able to train folks. I think we've trained about 25 individuals to do this parent education curriculum and youth curriculum, but in reaching these large amounts of parents who are showing up and expressing interest in how to be present for their young person. If we can go to the next slide. So engaging parents in youth sexuality education, some techniques that we've used is, it's from the youth side, because I had two different approaches that I felt like I could take in this presentation, but I was looking at some of the requests of information that you all had submitted, and it was really around how to communicate with the parents and keeping them engaged with youth that are in the school day. So the lens I'm going to take is the approach that we've used through a project, the ACT project that I was mentioning earlier, where we had after-school youth sexuality education. And so some of the approaches that we've taken is definitely making sure administration is aware of what the content is, of what we're talking about, and then putting that also into notifications that we could provide to the parents. And with that, it's a lot of partnership with other community-based organizations, especially those that are in the schools, those that are doing culturally based education. So that way there's full transparency of what the education is and what the topics entail. So with our Latino community, we developed a simple one-page outline that talked about what the youth were going to be talking about in their classes. And aside from sending it home in English and in Spanish to make sure it was language-centric, culturally specific, we made sure that those parent phone calls were happening. We made sure that relationships were being built from the start, that, if there was a school event, our educators were there, flyers were present, information sheets in the curricula was present, opportunities to introduce both the youth and the parent curriculum and how we're looking at fostering those intergenerational conversations was something that we made a forefront and a commitment to ensure that we're being present at any school activity. That includes the announcement boards, if there's any at the schools, any newsletters that you're sending home. Really, the community what they have shared up here, at least in the Multnomah County area, is that the ideal way to build relationship and have that confidence with the educator of the school is to see them, engage with them, have them show up, have them, even if there's conflict in language, doing what you can to be present and build that relationship. Using culturally specific approaches to communication is essential, making sure that documents are translated every time, not just every once in a while. Also making sure that there's transparency, so that goes back to the communication of what the lesson plans entail. And it doesn't have to be, anything incredibly thorough. And our approach has been, about two sentences, maybe 3 at the max, and then placing greatest emphasis on those conversations that are happening either over the phone or, when the parent or adult guardian is able to be at the school. Also incorporating and honoring the values and race and culture that our community members are bringing to the classroom environment, and how they're also experiencing this outside of the classroom environment. I like to remind folks that our world has multiple avenues to teach us different things about life, and so any form of engagement, any form of communication is an opportunity to tie in sexuality education, whether one's talking about, movies that are coming up, and song classes, even if it's, between a biology class and a history class. Liliana had a wonderful overview talking about historical trauma and, talking about using a racial justice lens in the conversations that we hold and tying in the historical traumas and that awareness of how reproductive justice has played out and sexuality education has played out in the past, and how can we break those myths and create the shift to reinforce that positive youth development through sexuality education. And so that all goes back to the values and looking at race and culture and how to promote education with not just our youth, but also our adult leaders in the community, whether it's administration, parents, any adult who is touching the life of a young person. And that reinforces the ongoing communication piece. I'm a strong believer that you can't talk enough about this topic, and finding ways to identify the overlap of sexuality education, whether one's talking specifically about identity or intimacy topics or sexual health and reproduction, about visiting a clinic maybe, looking at that holistic lens of how is this environment safe and encouraging, affirming for all identities and all aspects for sexuality education to be present, and for a person to enter that space comfortably. And that's where the communication comes through, whether it's, like I mentioned earlier, any documents you're sending home, any flyers, even homework assignments. I know a lot of folks listening to this webinar are in the school system, so looking at how any assignments that are sent home could maybe connect a learning opportunity for the young person from the trusted adult in their life. And I emphasize trusted adult because sometimes that trusted adult is not their parent or guardian. And so also using that lens for safety and security for the young person. On the next slide, I want to talk a little bit more about we have a chat box reflection. So what would you want to know from an educator or school in order to feel comfortable with your youth attending a sex ed class? So whether or not that's a child you might have of your own, or a niece or a nephew, what would you want to know? If you could just go ahead and enter a thought, like what would you want to know from an educator or from the school system, so you could feel comfortable with that young person attending a youth sex ed class? So I know some things that parents have mentioned in our past is wanting to know what the curriculum entails. They've also wanted to know if it's scientifically based. Thank you, that's something that somebody mentioned. somebody mentioned that they would want to know how the teacher planned to cover the topics that students feel embarrassed about, like tampons and masturbation. Yep, that's an excellent point, and that comes up a lot in a lot of the trainings that we lead with, that I have led with educators up here in Multnomah County, is how to respond without bias, and having neutral response. And so there's approaches that can go into training. And so definitely looking at what kind of trainings has the educator received to respond to student questions in a developmentally appropriate way. And that ties more to who is teaching it and the content. And I really appreciate the comment about how will my child feel accepted and included in the class. I think that also highlights, talking about the environment and the safety in the environment, and the approach to ensuring that safety and accountability and inclusivity are being encouraged in the class. That's wonderful. I see one question about if the child's culture would be reflected, and I think that's a really important aspect to consider, that many of our community members have wanted to know, including actually our youth as well. As we've gone through our youth sexuality education curriculum, one of the strongest feedbacks we've received is that they really value the opportunity to bring their identities into the conversation, whether or not that's them being the eldest sibling, first generation born, immigrant child, or just being Latino, and if that's the only identity they share, they choose to share at that point, just having the safety to have those conversations where their cultural identities and the intersection of those identities have a space in the sexuality education curriculum as well. Wonderful. So these are great ideas, and these are great questions that everyone has put forth. And I assure you that these are questions that all the adults that have youth in your classes are asking as well. And so that goes back to, I want to reinforce the communication and the connection. The building relationship can really help the youth sexuality education approach shine in the schools. Moving on for the parent education piece, because I like sandwiches. I can't eat them, but I like them. So I think about, sexuality education as a sandwich approach. You have the community-based approach, where, we have our educators, we have our adults who are trying to learn, we have our youth in the middle who are receiving this information, and then we also have the administration on the other side who's trying to find and secure funding so that way this work can continue, and so that to support the education piece. And so I want to talk a little bit more about the parent education piece, because we've talked about how to engage adults in the school system for the youth education, but how do parents get engaged? And I think in order to be an applicable parent, one of the approaches we've used is looking at Opciones de Educación, which is OYE. And it's basically started as a coalition back in 2008 of passionate individuals who are health educators and theater extraordinaires who really wanted to help these conversations occur in the adult communities, and how to break the stigma and look at a shift in culture. And so the coalition still exists, and we're still going strong, but through that coalition, curriculum has been developed and is bilingual. It's a bilingual sexuality education curriculum that has multiple topics, and it really begins with looking at what is sexuality education and how can we redefine what sexuality education is from how we came to know it as a young person in our home countries or our home geographical areas, wherever home is for us, and what did those lessons look like, and what do we want it to look like now? What do we want for our youth present day? So we start with redefining sexuality. We talk a lot about healthy relationships and consent, gender, orientation, STIs, what are they, how are they prevented? We also talk about family planning and contraceptive methods. and we looked at youth development and the phases of puberty and how it's a lifelong process. And we also have the opportunity to do a family night where we bring the youth and parents together to do a game of Jeopardy. And each session ends with an opportunity for these cross-generational conversations to take place. The parent education is truly just for the parents. The youth are traditionally not there. And the goal is to have a mock situation where at the end of each gathering, parents have the opportunity to practice how to receive a youth question or start a conversation with the youth based on the topic. And so we use a lot of blended activities that are traditional, kind of like teacher-educator based, but also popular education. And we try to lean more towards the pop ed base where the parents are honoring their own experiences and their expertise in those experiences and learning from each other. And so we use a lot of activities to try to encourage that. From the last 2 years of doing OYET in the schools as a parallel component, educational component to the youth education curriculum we've offered, we have found that parents have reported a huge increase in confidence in their ability to be present and hold a conversation with a young person about dating, puberty, consent, and healthy relationships and safety. So that's been a wonderful find for reassurance. We've also have heard that individuals have increased their awareness about what resources exist in the community around sexual health. And for some of the resources they already knew of, they were able to expand their knowledge of what was available at those locations. And a lot of individuals have expressed also increase in knowledge of anatomy, including medically accurate terminology and how to hold conversations with their young person regarding changes that their bodies might experience as a young person and then also as they continue to age through life. And there's a parent quote that I wanted to share with everybody that says, "I appreciate being able to build awareness, comfort, and acceptance of the importance of talking about sexual health with our youth." For some other lessons that we've learned is that community, when it comes to trying to implement sexuality education in the schools and the communities, community-based organizations are going to be ideal partners to engage with families because a lot of the trust is already built with those CVOs, a lot of relationships have already been formed. And so looking at how to partner with those organizations to ensure that communication is taking place and that information is being shared appropriately throughout their networks. Relationships are fundamental. There needs to be time to create those, honor that it'll take time, but also honor that the effort put in at the beginning will have immense payoff in the end because there'll be that trust and that engagement. And don't forget about, looking at values of the cultural community and honoring space for those identities to be present. And also recognize that the program is going to look different in different communities. You might have a program in one city and the next city over might look a little bit different. And that's great because that means it's centered on what the needs are of that community for communication, for relationship, and for education. And honoring that and being mindful of the approaches that honor that, keeping the historical traumas and a trauma-informed lens at the center of it all. That, I believe, is it for me that I wanted to share at this point. If you have any questions, you can reach me. Sorry, I forgot to put it up there, but you can reach me at Vanessa, VANESSA, at latnet.org. Sasha can also connect you to me. It's been a pleasure, and if you have any questions, I'm always available.
Thank you, Vanessa, so much. Again, such an informative presentation. We so appreciate your time and your expertise in sharing that with us today. I wanted to open it up for just a couple minutes and see if anyone has any final questions to ask in the chat box. We'll look at those for the next couple of minutes, so feel free to type that in. I also wanted to remind you all that all of the resources as well as the recorded webinars that we're doing in this series will be available on the OregonEdNet.org site. There's a comprehensive sexuality education site there that has a section for resources and a section for discussions. And in the resources section, there will be this recorded webinar for you, as well as all of the subsequent ones as well. So please just check that website out. It might have resources that you find useful, and it is a platform for you all to connect to each other and ask any questions that you may have. And just a reminder that this is also, like I mentioned, a whole series that we've launched throughout the school year. So it's the last Friday of every month until the end of the calendar year, and then it'll be sent out a new time and a new schedule, but it'll continue throughout the calendar year. Next month, so October 26th webinar, will be about teaching consent in the classroom and different techniques to prevent sexual assault and violence, and our role in that in teaching the health education standards and how they're integrally connected to those. So please join us then. We'll have one of our experts here as a guest speaker, and it'll be super informative again, and hopefully based in discussion as well with all of you. So thank you again, and we'll send out information, resources, as well as a registration form for next month. I don't see any questions in the chat box for us now, so that's fine. If you have anything that comes up later, feel free to connect to me, to your colleagues on the Oregon Educators Network, and anywhere else, connect to Liliana or to Vanessa as well. Thanks again, and keep in touch. We look forward to connecting with you again next month. Bye-bye.